finish up with a few details about cellular respiration. One thing is that almost any kind of food can be converted into something that can enter into some part of the cellular respiration process. As I was saying before, glucose is the only thing that goes through all of the steps starting at the beginning of glycolysis and goes all the way through. But if you started with something that was like a disaccharide or some other kind of carbohydrate, it would have to be broken down into a sugar that could enter into the glycolysis sequence. If it's a small sugar, it would enter further down within the steps of the glycolysis sequence, or even almost to the pyruvate stage. Proteins would enter in down here someplace, and fats could enter into various parts. So any kind of food could be converted into ATP for the cell to use. This is just an overview of the process and where the different kinds of food could be inserted into the cellular respiration. This next one, this is about the negative feedback loop that occurs in the process where the outcome, which is ATP, is going to inhibit an enzyme that is up at the beginning of the process and turn the process off. You might remember that we talked about this before. Negative feedback loop is a control factor for particular processes, and in this case, this enzyme called phosphofructokinase is our control enzyme. So what happens is ATP, or even citrate, which you remember is the first stable compound in the Krebs cycle, can turn off or allosterically inhibit phosphofructokinase, which is at the beginning of the glycolysis sequence. Once that happens, anything left in the process will continue on and continue making ATP and keep that phosphofructokinase from working. Once everything is through, though, ATP will become at a premium and it will then be pulled off of the phosphofructokinase, turning the process back on. Another thing that we need to talk about is the next thing, which is called fermentation. What happens is during fermentation is that this is a process that is going to occur in organisms that do not have oxygen or do not need to use oxygen in some cases, or can't use oxygen. Where you're going to see this is in the bottom of lakes or underneath polar ice, or in our bodies when we are using all the oxygen for our respiratory process and our muscles are starting to starve for oxygen. So what will happen is that I will do a process that is called fermentation. Now there's two types of fermentation, and these is called either alcohol or ethanol fermentation or lactic acid fermentation. If I have oxygen present, though, I'm going to use that in the mitochondria to do regular cellular respiration and create a whole lot more ATP. So you're going to see that in the fermentation process, which is right here, that only 2 ATP are generated. So let's look at this closer here. This one is the alcohol fermentation. So notice that glycolysis is happening. So where is this occurring? It's occurring in the cytoplasm. It does not need to use the mitochondria to do this process. And in order to keep this fermentation process going, what I really have to do it again is to generate some NAD, because remember, I'm creating NADH from the process. So glucose is going to be broken down into the pyruvate, just like we talked about. It's going to give me the 2 ATP, the 2 NADH, and if I want to keep running it, I've got to somehow get this back, right? This NADH back. So in this case, what happens is I take off a molecule of CO2 and create this acetaldehyde here that will then in order to get my NAD back, will be converted to ethanol. Ethanol is a 2-carbon molecule, and this process can never go back. So this is the what is used in making beer or wine, and it is this process. Once I produce the ethanol, I can never enter into the aerobic regular cellular respiration. On the other hand, lactic acid, which is what our muscles do, lactic acid fermentation, that's this one, it does the same basic thing. That is, it does glucose through the process of, uses glucose through the process of glycolysis, again, creating the ATP and NADH, to create the pyruvate. But in order to generate back the NAD to run it, to keep running this process, I create this molecule called lactate, or lactic acid. Lactic acid is a 3-carbon molecule, and once oxygen is present again, that lactic acid can be converted back to pyruvate and run this process again. So lactic acid is done in animals mainly when their muscles are lacking oxygen, generally speaking when you're running for a long period of time.